Welcome back to We Play Games. I'm Walker, and here we are about to do a basic country guide for Japan in Vicky 3 Academy. So we've done, basically an infinite amount of content about Japan, but we haven't done just a very brief strategic overview video in a long time. So that's sort of the way I want you to treat this, is if you're not sure where to start with Japan, then watch this video. So Japan in 1836... we have a really huge population, 31 million. That puts us roughly on par with France. But you can see here our GDP of 14.6 million should suggest to you that we have an awful lot of peasants, which you can confirm by just checking over here. Yeah, 89.4% of these pops are peasants. Okay, sure. So you basically are entirely non-industrialized, and that's due in part to our policy here of sakoku, which is a strict isolationism. Some Dutch ideas, especially Dutch medical and chemical and astronomy books, managed to sneak their way into Japan. People started learning Dutch in order to learn those things. Simultaneously, in the background, the daimyo were growing restless with the shogunate because they weren't able to go out and fight people. So that's why we have all these pops, is because we had relative peace. But that meant that the people who depended upon warfare in order to make money, they largely have been neglected during this shogunate period. So here in-game, we actually start with a character, Oshio Heihachiro, who attempted to overthrow the shogunate in 1836. And so this character is in-game as the leader of the Buddhist monks, and he starts with an insanely high popularity, 125. And that tells you right away that the characters that you have available to you in Japan at the beginning of the game are incredibly important. Not just Oshio, but also your starting monarch. Your starting monarch is a giant pain. Not only is he a shogunate-associated character, which is just always bad, but he's an arrogant, expensive taste shogunate character as well. So you really need to get rid of him as quickly as possible. Fortunately, you have a journal entry that does exactly that. The Honorable Restoration. If the shogunate are not part of the government, then this thing appears over here, sort of like your own little personal corn laws, although you do have regular corn laws too. But then if the shogunate are not powerful and not part of the government and no insurrectionary and is at peace and owns on all of Kanto for 10 years, then you get to switch out the shogunate for a restored emperor. So right now we have a military dictator in charge, but behind the scenes there is the Emperor Komei, the father of Emperor Meiji. And then of course if the restoration takes a long time, then you end up with a Meiji restoration instead of a Komei restoration. But I think your goal really should be to try to get rid of the Tokugawa as quickly as you can. They're really bad. Meticulous pious is not a terrible combination of character traits, but he's still still a shogunate character. The best thing that they have available to you here is traditionalist, which means that if you roll something like this, where you have a samurai that's traditionalist, then you can potentially begin by immediately moving into state religion, which could be pretty useful, because your goal is to make it so that the shogunate are not powerful. One way to do that is to do it with a military crackdown. If you want to know how to do that, my recommendation is to watch my Mandate of Heaven campaign video. I talk through all of the strategy there, but basically just concentrate your troops in your capital and then provoke a civil war, destroy them, their clout drops to 0, you can start your reorganization of your government from there. But if you're not interested in having a civil war, generally speaking, it's going to be a little easier if you re-roll into a jingoist, but it's not necessary. Rolling into a jingoist is useful because it gives you a way to make the landowners happy while changing laws around. Because eventually what you're going to want to do is you're going to switch into serfdom abolished, and then you're going to need to switch into mercantilism, but then you can switch into corn laws, you can get your laissez-faire online, and then you can go through and fix up some of these other side laws. You also want to get into appointed bureaucrats. Usually you even want to get into appointed bureaucrats earlier, but you have just a lot of laws that you need to fix is kind of the boiled down version of it. And so keeping your legitimacy kind of high or very high is really important here as Japan, because it's going to be critical to actually getting law work done. So if you can re-roll into a jingoist, then you can start off by moving into a professional army without the the shogunate resisting, that's really useful in the event that you're going to fight a civil war, because it makes it so the conscription rate is only 1% instead of 2% off of peasant levies. But it's not really like critical. You can win the civil war against the shogunate without moving into this, and you don't really need to move into colonial affairs unless you desperately want to for some reason, because I promise that if you get strong enough industrially, you can beat up whatever stupid European is dumb enough to colonize your islands. It just gives you an easy way to get ticking war score, that's all. So don't sweat it if you don't get into a jingoist for a shogunate. Your goal should be as quickly as you can, and if you start out like this, either switch into state religion right away, or go ahead and reform your government, bring the peasants in alongside the shogunate, and then just take like random chance stab chances at serfdom abolished. Because you can randomly get this. It's a 15% chance. If you want to really juice it, you could bring the intelligentsia in, but then you'd need to reduce your taxes, and you can't really afford to do that. So something like this, and then just rolling on serfdom, a 15% chance is not zero. You could also wait for a movement to appear, which would also give you a way to enact serfdom abolished. When it comes to your budget, you do start with an enormous pool of authority because you are an isolationist. Don't be afraid to use that to bolster the Buddhist monks, the peasants, if you would like the intelligentsia, but do not go in here and try to bolster the industrialists without having built anything that would actually supply industrialist pops, because it literally doesn't do anything. 200 authority doesn't change the rules of the game, and industrialists can only attract a certain type of professions. You are pre-industrial in terms of your construction here, so bolstering them is just a waste of 200 authority. What is not a waste of 200 authority, of course, is a minimum of 1 road maintenance in Kansai. It could even be better to just like strand a couple of them in specific locations, like Kyushu especially, because that's where your coal is going to be coming from, in Kanto. If you wanted to split them like this and just leave 3 road maintenances on the board, you could run services and sin. If you want a little bit more authority, so you can run an extra sin tax, of course, go up to high government wages, slap another one on there. Now we're at high taxation. We could even run very high if we want, but it's not strictly necessary. But now we have a very large pool that we can actually use to construct with. And that's kind of what you need to do as Japan, is build up to your growth cap as quickly as possible. And don't be afraid to just build a whole lot of construction sectors. In the event that you're trying to fight a civil war, of course, then one of the most important things is getting an early technology here on mandatory service, so that way you can get down to line infantry ASAP. Being in line infantry makes any civil war basically a free win. Just expensive, but a free win. But if you're not pushing for a civil war very quickly, you might benefit from going through cotton gin to lathe. Lathe is a very powerful technology when it comes to utilizing dye, and you start with an enormous capacity for dye. Because of the nature of arable land in the game, these Japanese dye provinces can be enormously productive if you want them. 232 dye is basically infinity. And so as Japan, one of the things that you have access to that a lot of other people don't is a combination of really good industrial goods in coal mines, in iron mines, as well as a reasonable amount of logging camps. You really have everything that you need in order to start an industrial revolution in Japan, but you don't have enough to kind of sustain an industrial revolution. And so any sort of campaign here in Victoria 3 as Japan inevitably is going to lead you to a point where you either need to be trading for the resources you need to continue your industrialization, accepting that you will not industrialize and becoming like super Cuba and just building like an infinite number of rice farms. Don't do that. And so being aware of where the resources are on the map, like coal mines being in Manchuria or in Korea, or just enormous amounts of wood being available in Indonesia, is very helpful as Japan. When it comes to updating your methods of production, I typically recommend that you don't make too many adjustments until you hit your first tool industry. Tools are going to come online pretty soon. I recommend putting them either in Kento or in Kensai. One thing that's important when it comes to reducing the power of the shogunate is that when you get to academia, because you are going to want to get to academia relatively soon, That's another early tech consideration. Because of this capital state modifier, any buildings in the capital are going to have more political pop strength. And so if you build more academia, more universities in Kansai, you'll actually give more power to your intelligentsia. When it comes to your starting characters, you actually start with some fixed generals and politicians as well. So you have this character, Tokugawa Nariaki, who is a jingoist petite bourgeoisie politician and general, and Igawa Hidetatsu, a shogunate reformer, and Tori Iyozo, a shogunate traditionalist. And so being aware of those characters can help you choose which characters you want to keep around. My recommendation right now is to just fire Tori Iyozo immediately, because you don't want a traditionalist shogunate around, because one strategy that you can use to reduce shogunate power, of course, is to utilize landed voting, and Buddhist monks can emerge as a strong counterweight to the shogunate. But if the Buddhist monks are too attracted to the shogunate, then they might form a party together. But recruiting generals is a very powerful way to modify politics in your country, especially if you don't go down the colonization route. Then you will have a ton of bureaucracy that you can sink into political figures. You can, if you wish, move into state religion or theocracy as Japan. Both of those are interesting choices. State religion, be aware that unlike a lot of the other countries that have state religion as an option and being like an autocratic dictator, you have like 25% of your population as Shinto. And so if you are discriminating against them, that's a large percentage of your pops that you're discriminating against. So just prepare for that. It's mostly, however, going to be lower strata pops. So it isn't going to dramatically decrease the strength of your country, but it will prevent you from having state Shinto ever. So be aware that you are sacrificing that. When it comes to your diplomacy and your development as Japan, I think you should build up a navy relatively quickly. I would aim to have a navy online that you feel comfortable bullying powers roughly as powerful as Brunei by the mid-1850s. If you can get it online earlier, go for it. If you feel really spicy, one thing that you can do is you can do force recognition wars against Great Britain and just build like one navy, invade one of their territories down here in Singapore, and just hope to hold it, win war reps from UK, win recognition from UK, and be off to the races. Just saying, you can go that direction. It's pretty powerful. It feels a little cheesy, but it is pretty powerful. But I do recommend, kind of no matter which direction you're going in, that when it comes to your technology, you really have a couple of choices. I think it's going to be cotton gin into lathe, or it's going to be mandatory service into line infantry, especially if you're aiming to win a civil war, or immediately jumping in on academia, or possibly taking colonization. Although, again, I actually recommend against going into colonization. I think of it largely as a trap. I think you need the bureaucracy in order to hire and utilize characters correctly, because characters in an incredibly autocratic society like Japan are really, really important. And so getting these guys up and going so that way they have political influence is way more important than if you can colonize Hokkaido all the way, because you can beat them up, you can get them out of here. One thing that's really interesting playing as Japan is that Japanese is an East Asian heritage culture, which means that you share the same culture trait with the overwhelming majority of the population of China. And so you can be on racial segregation, which just requires you to share a heritage cultural trait with a primary culture in order to be accepted, and thereby accept enormous chunks of China, while also having a huge bonus to your standard of living increases and decreases, and a lot of extra authority. And so if you're aiming to go down into command economy, and you've never done command economy before, then my recommendation is actually to try it out with Japan, because Japan can do it pretty easily. You could even be in state religion if you want, because state religion as a Mahayana also means that you tolerate the overwhelming majority of the pops in China. And of course, Japan plus China is essentially enough resources to do whatever you want to in regards to map painting. And so the sky really is your limit. There's wonderful natural directions for you to expand as Japan. Down here, especially, there's tons of coal. And one thing that you're naturally short of as Japan is coal. Historically, Japan tried to solve this by moving into Manchuria and Korea. And you should do that too, but don't restrict yourself to just there unless you're doing it for flavor reasons. Taking over Indonesia makes a lot of sense because there's an awful lot of wood, especially hardwood in here, but there's also rubber and there's oil. And so if you are trying to industrialize Japan moving forward, then securing access to your own oil is absolutely critical. Some of it is found in China, some of it's found in Indonesia, and you could colonize and imperialize out here, but I think that generally speaking, the things that you're going to be looking for as Japan are going to be iron and coal, which you're going to find from down here, rubber and hardwood, which you can find here, and opium, which you can find here in Southeast Asia. And if you follow those as your basic expansion paths as Japan, you'll do very well for yourself. And of course, opportunistically attack Qing basically whenever you can, because the pops that you conquer from them are worth way, way, way more than they're worth to anybody else. And they're worth way, way, way more to you than anything else. And we are really developing our GDP pretty quickly if you go down this path. But you can remove serfdom pretty well if you set yourself up for success as Japan. And then from there, do whatever you feel like you need to get the shogunate weak enough that they will collapse. All right, so once you're at this point, my recommendation is let the shogunate get less angry. One way, of course, around getting the shogunate this angry is to have a jingoist, but it's demonstrably not necessary in order to get serfdom gone. In order to get the shogunate any weaker, you're gonna have to either fight a civil war against them or wait for this anger to disappear, because you don't want to remove them from the government and have them join this restore serfdom movement, because then their radicalism will jump to over 100, you'll have a civil war, and if you don't have line infantry online, it can be kind of rough, especially if you're still in peasant levies. You might want to remove your barracks outside of your capital, but doing this too early, of course, can mean presenting yourself as being very weak, which means that other nations might come out of the woodwork to bully you. You do have a whaling industry journal entry, but that's largely ignorable. And be warned, corn laws is not going to work for you as Japan the same way that it works for everybody else, because you actually can't set tariffs while you're in isolationism, because you can't do trade when you're in isolationism. And so you do need to get into mercantilism in order to do corn laws, but that's going to require you just build up a lot of industry, which is why I think doing a little industrial loop is going to be useful for most people. Getting construction done is just going to be really, really helpful when it comes to getting politics done. And so don't be afraid to build up a larger construction sector than you're used to seeing. That's sort of a feature, not a bug. But eventually we will come up with a solution to get the shogunate the rest of the way. Again, the easiest way, I think, in 1.1.x is to just civil war them. But if you wanna play them out with jingoist, I think that's a perfectly valid way to do it too. That's Walker. That's a basic country guide for Japan here on We Play Games. Take care.